So, Mr. Kit, Temporary Utopias, you finished it 2 years ago. It took 4 years to make, brings together over a decade of recordings. Um, how does it feel to finally have it out there for people to be listening to it?
I'm As a sense of relief. I'm just really happy that it's now available and accessible to people. Um, it's hard to hold on to an album once you've finished it, and there's obviously a great feeling that you want to give it the best opportunity you can of either finding a label or reaching as many people as possible through publicity opportunities or whatever. But I think after a while, you really just like, I shouldn't be holding on to this anymore. I think that's where it got to with Temporary Utopias, because I had so many near misses with record labels. And eventually I was like, well, I have to do something about this because this work needs to, I can't hold on to it anymore. It starts to feel like it's got to live its own life. And so I'm happy that now it can live its own life in the ears of others and in their minds, hopefully as well. Yeah.
Hmm. And you had it mastered recently. Why did you decide to self-release it?
It was not my first choice, and this was a really hard road to navigate because across the 2 years that I was sending it to labels and trying to draw some attention to it, as I said, there was some real close. I had a label saying they wanted to release it, and then they backed out later on. During the process, I was offered a publishing deal, which collapsed, and I got really close with a few other labels who were like, we really love this, but now it's not the right time. I've got too many records in our schedule. Um, After a while, it was I was exhausted. I was exhausted by this process. It's hard to keep, putting your work out like that and getting some really good responses that were genuine and it not landing anywhere. Or like in instances of some labels not wanting to take the risk because it's so multi-genre, which can be difficult because a lot of labels are there representing a particular genre. Um, so there was a point where I didn't really know what to do. I didn't really know what to do about it. I was like, I had all these hopes and dreams as to how the record would come out, that it would be on a particular label that I had my eyes on, and that it would come out on like who doesn't want their record to come out on a double LP, beautifully pressed with an orange splat on the record or whatever. So I had to get really comfortable with all those ideas changing and allow myself to feel. Yeah, there was a hard point last year where I was like, you need to face up to kind of where it's at and how it's gone. And there's been so many little successes along the way, but there's this ache now that's building because you need to release the work. It's hard to spend, like 6 years from conception to release is a long time. So yeah, last year I was like, right, let's give this a crack and self-release it and see what that's like. It's more important now that it's out there that it can be heard than it is to like hold it in the hopes that someone else sees the value in it than I do. It's like sometimes it's a kind of gatekeeping thing, where you feel like the worth of the art is dictated by somebody else, some stranger with particular musical tastes who like some music on a Monday and then on a Thursday they're like, nah, I don't like that anymore. So you have to kind of contend with that feeling and be like, well, how much longer can I let someone else decide whether this is valuable or worthwhile or worth, giving it that energy? So I need to give it that energy. Yeah. So that's what led me to wanting to self-release.
And why do you think labels are so resistant to heterogeneous works, multi-genre concept albums? This is, I think, its greatest virtue is that it's so diverse. You know, there's infinite number of kind of moods and instrumentation, and so on. And it's always exciting. It's always surprising. Do you think labels assume, perhaps incorrectly, that listeners are just not ready for something that's like so unpredictable in a way?
Yeah. I think, I mean, these are assumptions based on the reception that I got from various labels. And the feeling I've got is that there's a lack of risk taking in a lot of record labels that either I'm personally connected to or that I follow because I like their output. Because there's a sense of um, that everything, like people's attention is strangled and money is strangled, and it's like a sense of scarcity, which I don't always buy into. And that sense of scarcity, I think, can make people really hold on to a particular idea of how something should be, how they feel something should be. And then it kind of can generate a stubbornness about the choices that you make. I think as an example, one of the labels I was in talks with the record, over a span of time, they got to hear some of the tracks maybe 2 years in of the 4 years. And they were really, really enjoying it. As the album got more diverse, that's when there was a growing distance, because if you have an ambient label that really just kind of delves into that, or you've got a label that likes the kind of jazzy, fusiony stuff, but there's only one fusion track on the record, I have to also contend with that, where it's like, okay, if you're going to accept to put this record out, you have to be willing to take the risk that your listeners don't always know what they want, and that your label doesn't always know what they should be putting out. Nothing's a guarantee. And I think, like, at the moment, there's a sense where everything has to be a guarantee, because otherwise you might lose some of the followers that always buy your record from your label, or you might start losing listeners on streaming platforms, which I don't buy into. Like, people love being surprised, and I think, like, if you give people the chance to be surprised, there's something very powerful in that. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm at with it.
And can you talk a bit about how this album came about? Did you intentionally set out to make something that captured your sonic, musical, and cinematic interests? Because it is very cinematic. I think that's kind of goes without saying. There's, I hear a lot of Vangelis, for instance, and I think you're influenced by Blade Runner. Um,
Yeah, it can be, the process can be traced back to pretty much one album that I found really inspirational. I was in Dalat in Vietnam in 2017, staying at this, helping kind of put together this cafe homestay. And I was listening to this bootleg copy of the Blade Runner soundtrack. And for the aficionados, it is the Esper edition. It's a 2 CD. I think there's like a 5 CD version, which includes all these other fun bonus stuff. But the 2 CD version, I completely fell in love with it. You never leave the world. You're always in Blade Runner. You can always hear atmospheric sounds throughout, and all these pieces of music weave in and out with also cuts from dialogue and things like that. And I think there's something about Blade Runner which has been expressed many, many times, and it's something I connect to. Somehow that world is so attractive to live in. You somehow want to bathe in it. You want to wear the clothes and smell the smells and feel those things that Deckard feels in the film. And the Esper edition, for me at least, completely soaks me in that world. And so I was like, what would it be like to return to some things I was exploring with Trey M, where I was doing field recordings and expressing those places in music? what would it be like if I immerse people entirely in this world, in a new musical space? What if I continued to gather field recordings, but took ones from lots of other places? It wasn't just Vietnam focused, and soak people in this uh, world as much as possible.
I think that's a really interesting thing you say about the Blade Runner world being attractive to live in because it's a
Yeah,
dystopian noir world of crime and
yeah,
sort of rampant consumerism. Whereas I think with your album, it's also a world we want to live in, but it's much more organic. You know, there's the sounds and textures and colors of everyday life, and I think you use a lot of it ubiquitous sound here. The field recordings you've sort of amassed over your journeys, and you've lived all over the place, Vietnam 3 times. Um, some of the tracks, kind of 50% music, 50% dogs barking or
yeah.
strange hypnotic sounds. We were you trying to sort of make a point about the music of the everyday, or is that sort of stretching the point too far?
I wouldn't say it's stretching it. I like that that's how you've experienced it. I think that's perhaps easier to feel and hear in the more natural spaces in the record. Um, I wanted to give people the chance of soaking in a space so much where they could get to know it intimately, where it's not like, oh, like we're moving from one piece of music to the next. Here's 5 seconds of some dogs. Because in many ways, the world that underpins all the music is the focal point, and the music is something that was built to it, that was built for it, as a gesture, as a statement of reverence, as an expression of gratitude for all those places that I spent time in, and all these places that became temporary utopias for me. Um, so yeah, something I'd like to do, which I think I maybe I can do this year, is to put together a beatless version, a musicless version of Temporary Utopias, where it's just the field recording, so that you can dive into the space, or you can put it on in the background and live in that space, but without the music, and pick out certain things that you might recognize from the album, but without the music as well. I think might be quite an interesting thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, as you say, there's a really distinct sense of space. And whether that's Vietnam, you know, I've been to Vietnam, so I recognize those sounds. Um, or something more kind of universal like a harbor, you know, the ship bell, which you sort of is a motif. You quote it in several tracks. I mean, most prominently in Boat Life, this sort of epic instrumental symphony, hip hop symphony almost. And then in Mango Rock as well. Um, can you talk a little bit about the concept of the album and the sort of places that you are representing,
Yeah,
bringing to life?
I think what I loved about the Esper edition of Blade Runner soundtrack was that you got immersed in this world. However, it's one world, and you never leave it. You visit multiple areas of this place, and you get to know it very intimately. But it's still kind of one distinctive mode or mood. Um, Whereas what I really wanted to explore was to explore how I could express how vibrantly different these places I've been to are, and how unbelievably, yeah, how extremely different those places have made me feel. And it seemed most appropriate that different genres of music will be able to help harness and express the variety of places. So when I began putting together sketches, which I often do when I start a record, I'm either writing notes on how things, on the kinds of feelings I'm looking for, or literal chords or motifs. For Temporary Utopias, quite early on, I had this sense of wanting to move from a city space all the way through to a countryside space, and all that in between. And it was in response to where I was at the time, where I'd spent a bit too long in Hanoi, which one can do, and it can get quite intense. You know, there's a lot of chaos here and a lot of noise, and I was really craving that countryside space. And I did make that transition myself. From the start of the album, when I was making it, I was living in Hanoi, and then by the end, when I'd finished it, I was living in the countryside. So interestingly, there was my own narrative followed the narrative of the record. Um, but the more I kind of wondered if it was necessary to be very prescriptive about the journey that you take. And when I wrote the summary of the album, I remember starting that and wondering, is this the right thing to do? Because do I want to dictate the journey to people? How much do I want to do that? Do I want to create an imaginary space? And how literal do I want to be about where you are and what's happening? But when I did sit down to write, the way through the record, that felt kind of like the right thing to do. And you mentioned before when you've listened to it that you had your own. The point is that everyone has their own experience with the record and finds themselves in places that maybe they feel familiar with, or maybe not. And how do you fill in the gaps of that space that you're in? You know.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the term world music is a kind of problematic, offensive, Western centric phrase. But for me, this is world music because it has the sounds of the world, but you're also blending kind of strange sort of Eastern scales in the unpronounceable track Tualin Pinchen. Can you say it for us?
Toilin Pin Chun Shua Shun Shua.
Okay, yeah. So in that track, you've got these kind of Game Boy sounds. It's quite there's a mechanical, like digital quality, and then you've got these flute wind um textures and strange Eastern scales that are blending together. And I think that you've got this sort of East-West rendezvous, as it were. And then in other places, it really you really leave up to the listener's imagination to sort of fill it in. You go kind of where are we? There's footsteps. There's a
Yeah.
prowling cat sound, or what I think that's probably. How did you make those strange animal noises? Because there are quite a few animal sounds.
Yeah.
Whether they are actually animals, I'm not sure. But yeah, how did you make them?
So the you can hear these animal noises and squeaks and squawks that are all come from the trumpet. So I was playing the trumpet through a silent mute, which is for practice to quiet yourself down enough so you don't disturb your neighbors, with a contact microphone on the front fed through a wah pedal, which would mean that you get this as you go through the notes. And yeah, I was, especially for Mango Rock, I was playing in response to the environment. So I would sit, before the music was made, I would sit and listen to the field recordings of Mango Rock because there's a very long dawn chorus. The full size field recording from Mango Rock is 40 minutes. So I would sit and listen to the full length version and listen to the animals as they wake up. And then I'd play the trumpet alongside to try and find ways to blend it in. Um, and so that's what you can hear alongside the other animals in Mango Rock, and they also appear in Tualin for short, as a way to kind of let you know where we're going. It's like a premonition, if you will, for later on in the album.
Yes, and I think the way you repeat sounds adds a real coherence. For instance, the ship bell in Boat Life, and then how that's repeated elsewhere. I can kind of hear so many different influences. So we mentioned Vangelis, the first track, really, wow, what a confident opening. It's highly euphoric and really reminded me of sort of I don't Michael Cassette or some progressive
Yeah,
dance or something. But there's no like beat. You might imagine it might go into a kind of thumping dance floor banger, but it
yeah.
and then we're led into this sort of hypnotic jazz fusion. Um, so who were you listening to when you were making this? Because I do hear a real range, especially in Bisparcular, the one that the second track that we have this euphoric opening leads into Weather Report, for instance.
Mm,
Then
mm.
Secede. I think in terms of the kind of broader architecture of temporary utopias, I really hear a lot of Trishasla. I'm not even sure that's a real word. Secede is making up his own language, sonically and linguistically. So yeah, yeah. What were your influences, and who were you kind of listening to as you were producing?
I think you were pretty bang on with Secede. Both Trishasla and Vega Libra, hugely influential in my musical life. Decades of influence from those records. Um, Blam Strain released an album around the same time that Secede and Yagya were all on Sending Orbs, which was at the time was run by Kettle. And Blam Strain's album, you start in the center of a city and you move out from it, and that was really instrumental. It's an ambient record, but there's tension and it's very dystopian. Um, Albums where I can get completely and entirely lost in a world, I'm very attracted to, because I like music that has escapist qualities, but something that immediately takes you out of and snaps you back into yourself. Um, I find that process really alluring. What else? Horace Arnold, not the most well known drummer in the jazz world, but he had, there was a double album that I picked up on CD around the time that I started making By Sparkula, which is like, was hugely influential. So it's worth checking out his stuff because there's an album with him, and I think it's Jan Hammer from Mahavishnu Orchestra as well, plays on one of his records. And it's an absolute espresso shot. Like it's completely batshit. And I think that, yeah, with By Sparkula, it was allowing myself to, and this may be the first instance in my catalogue of music of a piece of music making me laugh. Was when I was writing it, and I was starting to just be like, all right, this is just going to go wherever it's going to go. And I'd listen to it, and it would make me laugh because I was like, this is ridiculous. What a ridiculous piece of music. It makes like, just like suddenly shifts and it moves into these different spaces. And then like drumming shifting in different time signatures and moving all over the place, and there's polyrhythms all over the shop. But that was interesting. That was a new experience because I was like, usually I'm looking for a piece of music to make me tear up or connect to it in a way where I'm like, woof. But for something to make me laugh was a really different way of connecting to a piece of music that I was making, and was a nice indicator of feeling like I was on the right track.
I think you mix the light and the dark very well on this album. There's Monkey See, Monkey Do is probably the most sort of triumphantly exuberant piece of music I've heard for
Yeah.
years, and it just puts a smile on your face. But then there's also these sort of darker, um, more tender sounds. How organic was the kind of blending of those moods?
I was very hesitant to work on any pieces, any darker pieces intentionally, because I'd finished I around, yeah, 2017. I just finished another record which may come out this year. That one's been on the back burner for a very long time, and I just finished making that record. It was a very serious record, and that was off the back of Issa, which was another very serious record. So I just made two albums back to back, pretty much, that were quite serious. With each one, I was trying to find the lightness, find something less weighty. And so when I started Temporary Utopias, I was like, there will be no sad, dark music or no challenging. I don't want, like, I mean, I was even like, I don't want any drones, because I'm not like, and you can't control what needs to be born when you start the process. So as I was going through, like, Darji was one of the first pieces of music, funnily enough. Darji and Tip Likes the Sky were both made in 2018. in the early parts of 2018, and were the only two tracks that were fully made and almost entirely completed whilst I was living in Vietnam. And they're both completely different, tonally and emotionally. And I'm glad I gave it, over time, became more comfortable with like, yeah, man, it's okay if you want to return to the drone world. Just know that like your route to it's going to be different this time, because the source material is different, the equipment you're using is different, your mindset is different. And I'm now like at a much more accepting place with understanding the balance and the importance of having the contrast. If you don't have the contrast, if you've got one record that's all just like super, super happy, it then means that some of the tracks, it becomes too like one note, you know, and how do you actually give some of the happier tracks more of a chance to be the happiest they can be is by having other tracks that venture into some more challenging or darker places. So I was glad at least I could become a bit more comfortable with that process later on.
Mm. So it's your third LP, and I think um, one major difference or departure perhaps in this is the kind of prominent use of the trumpet, which you took up um, a few years ago. And I wondered, how has learning the trumpet informed your approach to composition?
When I began lessons on the trumpet, it was in 2018, a couple months after conceptualizing Temporary Utopias. I knew that I was aware of the gaps in what I was able to make, the gaps and holes in my compositions, and it was a lot to do with melody and harmony. And I needed to find a way to have access to train myself to start to hear things differently. And so the trumpet was a really good route to changing how I was hearing. So my journey on the trumpet kind of coincided with the journey of Temporary Utopias, where I conceptualized the album. A couple months later, started learning trumpet. In about year 3 of writing the album, I was like, okay, cool. I'm now at a point where I can start using this instrument in the record. But how it guided the compositional process, like Monkey See, Monkey Do, would not exist. The melody lines in Monkey See, Monkey Do would not exist if I hadn't started picking up the trumpet, because they're things that can be sung. It's like in that track, there's a lead with such a joyous kind of vocal sound that I don't know if I would have had access to that if I hadn't been very dedicated and committed to expanding how I could hear. So yeah, I think a lot of the movement, the micro movement in the melody throughout the record is hugely informed by the trumpet. And yeah, as I say, I don't think it would exist if I hadn't have taken on that journey.
Mm. And more quotidian question. I know you've made this album across places and countries, continents, but if you could, how would you describe a typical day in the studio?
It tends to start in either one of these two places where I'm either up for playing, and by playing I mean sitting down and creating space to twiddle on the synth or play with the trumpet and follow my interest, follow my curiosity, follow the excitement. Or the second way tends to be I already have a distinct idea, whether it's I was in bed the night before, nodding off to sleep, and I could hear some music. And so then I might want to kind of enter into a space where I can bring some of those things in, start writing out melodies, and then seeing where that goes. So it kind of tends to look like that. But I tend not to put too much restraint on how or when or the circumstances surrounding it, because I'm very trusting of my relationship to creativity. So I mean, I recently put together a new EP of music in a day in a cafe, just using my laptop as a real fun exercise of getting back to basics, and working with a set of parameters that can be quite confining. But also, I made some techno recently on my synth in this space, and I think it's important for me to remain adaptable, not too adaptable in which it starts to become a hindrance, but adaptable in that there isn't necessarily a typical day, because it's always happening in different ways, you know.
Mm. And then I thought we could just finish with hearing some of your thoughts on music consumption. You've been very vocal about in your criticism of streaming platforms like Spotify, which yeah, is kind of akin to piracy, how cheap it is, and the shady deals that they make with the record labels with no input from the artists. Um, what do you think the future of music consumption should and might look like?
I mean, the very simple answer is more equitable deals for artists across the board. So I have no issue in many regards. I have no issue with the format, the software itself, the algorithm. Sometimes on Spotify, like as a piece of software, and what it does, and what it offers you is tremendous. And the reason why it's so popular is because of what a good job it does at helping you find new music, or allowing you to listen to lots of kind of music that sounds all the same because you want to listen to all this chill hop for 12 hours straight or whatever. Um, but I feel that it drastically alters your listening habits. It drastically alters how you listen, how you choose to interact with the music, what kind of memories you're building. Because I think it was Tom Waits who said that music is decoration for the imagination. So, how much space do you give yourself for your imagination to be decorated? And how is that possible if you're being told what to listen to, and maybe you're listening in a constant stream of music throughout the day because you're at work? I'm more interested in ways of connecting to art forms of any kind, but as we're talking about music, I'll focus on music. Ways that you can gift people more personal experiences with music beyond the live setting where it's more communal, where you can give space for people to really understand their connection to sound. And I think it's not it's not going to come from platforms like that. I think it's you need a balance between how you, and I use this word on purpose, how you consume music, to then how you actually listen to music, and what platforms do you use can help facilitate that. Um, so I became more vehemently anti-Spotify with some of their recent changes to their policy, how they were paying artists, as they're funneling a large portion of un um, funneling a large portion of, I think it's like 90% of their catalog exists to have earned about $3 per artist, which doesn't become enough to send that money to the artist because of administrative fees and that kind of thing. But then they've taken that $3 per for 90% of their catalog and then are funneling it up into the artists that are already popular. In order to earn $3, you have to have, I think it's around 1,000 plays. So you've got a great deal of people that exist and support the platform that are being completely ignored. And to say that $3 isn't meaningful isn't the right attitude to have, really. I don't think. So I was umming and ahhing about. I've been umming and ahhing about Spotify, in particular because they're so huge and they have such a huge influence on the music industry. It's a massive conglomerate. So I was umming and ahhing about TU. Can it go? Can the album go on there? Do I want that? And then I was like, no, if I was selling this album in shops and I had the opportunity to choose the shops it would be in, I would probably make similar decisions where I'd be like, yeah, I like this shop. I like the atmosphere of this place. I like visiting this place. This is a great record shop. I hope that you could host and sell my record. And I feel similarly to streaming platforms, which is why I ended up choosing Quobuzz. So the album's coming out on Quobuzz on the 19th of February. I think it's one of the only streaming platforms that it's coming out on. And that's largely to do with the fact that Quobuzz pays artists about 10 times more than Spotify. And their platform is more geared to having a bit more of an experience with the record. Liner notes are much more clearly present. The way that they treat the music, everything is by standard, it's high resolution. But it's still not the answer. For me, the answer is having a physical object in your hand, or like at the very least having a relationship to how you buy music. It changes the meaning drastically if you know you've spent £7 or £8 on a piece of art.
Great. So, anyone watching this who hasn't yet got your album, it's available on Bandcamp, and everyone should go and buy it, and on Quobuzz, which is a new platform to me at least. So I'll check it out on there. Well, Mr. Kit, thank you very much. And yes, Temporary Utopias, fantastic album. Look forward to listening to it again.
Yes, Dom, thank you for hosting.
Okay.